Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Sit Heads Meditation Club. My name is John. I organize this group. Sit Heads is a sitting and social group for people interested in deep meditation practice. Everything that we do is free and donation-based. The same is true for tonight's event. Tonight, we are very lucky, unbelievably lucky, still pinching myself lucky, to be joined by Joseph Goldstein. Welcome, Joseph. I'm really glad to have you here. Is it okay if I do a hopefully not too embarrassing introduction for you?
Yes, keep the hyperbole low.
I'll see what I can do, but your biography lends itself to hyperbole. So I'll cut the bit where I call you one of the most influential meditation teachers of the last 50 years. I'll just leave that part out, shall I? All right, so Joseph Goldstein is a meditation teacher. Beginning in the 1960s, he spent 7 years in India studying with some of the great meditation masters of the 20th century. People like the legendary Anagarika Munindra, the great Deepa Ma. Then with his colleagues, Sharon Salzberg and Jack Kornfield, two other people you may have heard of, Joseph co-founded the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, which helped spark the Vipassana movement in the West. Joseph continues to teach worldwide, co-lead IMS, while still finding time, and I find this very impressive, for regular long retreats of his own. Joseph is he's also studied with, my understanding is he's studied with teachers in the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition as well, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, the great 20th century Dzogchen master. Joseph is also the author of several really excellent books. He wrote The Experience of Insight, Insight Meditation, a number of others, and his magnum opus, the recently published Mindfulness, one of my favorite meditation books. So I hope that wasn't too hyperbolic, Joseph. So, okay, good. So what we're going to do is Joseph and I are going to chat. I find that often helps seed the Q&A, gives people some ideas for the sorts of questions they might want to ask. And then we'll open it up to Q&A from everyone. Does that sound okay, Joseph?
Yeah.
All right. Anything you want to say before we get started?
No, let's dive in.
All right, let's do it. So one question that I always like to ask is, I've been assured by many, many teachers that even for very busy people with busy lives, jobs, people maybe even who live in big cities, fast-paced, people with families, that it is still possible to achieve deep insight and even what is classically referred to as awakening. So I've been sort of told that that's the case. My question then is, for people who want to do that, for people who have that aspiration, but are enmeshed in this very busy life, they're sort of lay people, what does their practice need to look like practically, as sort of brass tacks as we can get, in order to sort of have a shot at that? Now, that might have to do with how much formal practice they do. It might have to do with what their daily life looks like. It might have to do with how much retreat they go on, how they engage with their phones. I don't know. What do you think they need to do in order for that to be really a viable thing, a realistic thing for a modern day layperson?
Well, I think the Buddha really answered that question very specifically and accurately when he was asked, how long will enlightened beings continue in the world? And he said that as long as people are following the Eightfold Path, because it's a path that leads someplace, and it leads to awakening. Now, often people think of the path as simply or only formal sitting meditation, but the Eightfold Path really encompasses many different aspects of our lives. And so to start with, I would suggest people do a little study, and really get a comprehensive understanding of what each of those steps are. And there are many, many places to investigate this. Bhikkhu Bodhi, one of the great translators of the Pali Canon, wrote a very good book called The Noble Eightfold Path. In my book, Mindfulness, I have quite a few chapters on the path, with each chapter, one of the steps. And I think that would provide a basic foundation of understanding what it is that's actually needed in response to your question, because the Buddha said, this is the path that leads to awakening. So it's quite direct. So that would be a first step, I think, to really get a comprehensive understanding, and that it means a lot more in the practice. We have to engage in the practice in a much broader field than simply sitting, although sitting is obviously a key component. Okay, so that's one thing. Clearly, a daily practice is really essential. Mm-hmm. We're so overwhelmed by the busyness of our lives and by the incredible amount of input, through media and news, and it's so easy to just get caught up in the swirl of our lives.
Yeah.
Have a regular time each day, just to quiet down a bit and to disengage. And as you mentioned, many people live really busy lives, but I have known people who are incredibly busy, right? Are really fully engaged with life and their professions and work, and are still committed to sitting at least an hour a day. And some of my friends, again, very engaged in the world, not Dharma teachers, they're not on retreat all the time. They're living actively in the world, made a commitment to sit 2 hours a day. So it is possible to do that if the aspiration is strong, and maybe it means getting up an hour earlier or whatever it is. But if the aspiration is there, it is possible to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so somebody said they kept trying to do this and it was just impossible. And actually, somebody from New York, this goes back years, and they couldn't figure out how to do it. And then they came up with a solution, which I thought was rather brilliant.
What is it?
Yes, I'm going to tell you in a moment, but I wanted to have that pregnant pause so people can really get ready for it.
We're all leaning in.
This person said that when they saw they just were not following through on the commitment to a daily practice, what they did was to make a commitment to at least get into meditation posture once a day. That was all. It wasn't a commitment to sit for an hour or any length of time. The commitment was simply to get into the posture. Now, is there anyone here who could not commit to that? I think not. That's a pretty minimal commitment. However, what this person discovered was that once he got into the posture, very often he would just keep sitting for some time, and the time might vary. But it was making the transition from the busyness of life to sitting that was the problem. It wasn't about the commitment to sit. And so I just found that a really interesting piece of advice, which I've passed on to people. And just recently, I mentioned that to somebody and they got back to me and said, this really works. I just get into the posture and then, okay, I'll sit for however long I do on that day.
Yeah.
Then with that, I guess one other thing, and we could spend the whole hour talking in response to this question.
Yes.
One of the things that I think we can notice about our lives is the amazing power of habit. both for good and for bad. But once we do something, a few times and we get into the habit of it, it just becomes much easier.
Yeah.
It's like those neural pathways get deepened or strengthened, whatever happens in the brain. So this idea of just getting into the posture and then sitting for however long, it's establishing the habit of a daily sit.
Yeah.
And once we have that habit well established, then could play with, okay, can I extend the time? If it's 15 minutes, maybe it's half an hour can be an hour. So we play, but the habit is there and we just know that's the time we sit. One other area which I'll mention,
okay,
because it's been such a powerful part of my own practice, but it's really just one of the steps of the Eightfold Path, but one that I think we don't pay that much attention to, and that is right speech. In the course of a day, we talk a lot. And yet I think it's very rare that we're really bringing an acute mindfulness to our speech, and thinking maybe before we speak, is this useful? Is it helpful? Just that, if we could be mindful, if we could undertake the practice of being mindful when we speak, that would infuse the day with so many moments of mindfulness, and it will have a tremendous impact on our relationships. Yes, so there's a lot more to say about right speech, and I'd encourage people actually to read up on that part of the Eightfold Path, just as a a reminder, like a mindfulness bell before we speak. There's an acronym that somebody came up with, and the acronym is WAIT, W-A-I-T, and it stands for, why am I talking?
Yeah.
And I love that, because often there's no very good reason why we're talking.
Yep.
And just to have that come into mind and to say, okay, is what I'm about to say, is it helpful? Is it useful? Is it worth saying or not? And I just noticed in my own mind, there's plenty of intentions to speak where it's not particularly useful or helpful. And when I don't, it really feels like a small victory. Oh, mindfulness, a moment, this is not helpful. Just a moment of restraint, a moment of renunciation. And these moments are powerful. We shouldn't diminish the importance of these small, very pointed moments of awareness and mindfulness. So there's a lot. I mean, your question was a very large one.
Yeah.
These are a few of the things that come to mind.
Great. I mean, and right speech is really the one, it's one of the only forms of mindfulness or parts of the path that you can't really practice on retreat, right?
Right, exactly.
You're sort of practicing it by default. You're in silence, but that's easy. I'm always acutely aware when I come off of retreat how a lot of my other forms of mindfulness are fairly sharp. Right speech.
Yeah. So it would really be good to undertake it with a strong intentionality, and use the acronym.
Yep.
Why am I talking? Before one starts to talk.
Yeah. There's a thing that I sometimes say to myself it's not an acronym, so it's slightly less cool, but it's a lyric. It comes from David Byrne from the Talking Heads. He says in a song, "When I have nothing to say, my lips are sealed." And it's a lyric from like one of the all-time great songs, and that always comes to my mind. When I have nothing to say, my lips are sealed. So mine aren't, but I'm working on it. Yeah, when I asked another teacher that we had join us as a guest Beth Upton, I asked her this same question, what does it take, brass tacks? I'm always hoping someone's going to say, well, on average, you need to go on 6 weeks of retreat per year. You should be meditating. I never get, no one ever gives you the numbers, and I'm unsurprised by that. But what she said was that, and I'm curious for your thoughts on it, and then we'll keep going. But she said, above all, you need an inclination toward, she called it an inclination toward nibbana, or an inclination toward abandonment, toward renunciation, toward simplicity, that you need like a really heartfelt, that change in the heart has to take place. And then I asked her, well, what if you don't have that, or you don't have it strongly enough? And she said a few things, but a lot of it was, she's, good company, good spiritual friends can help with that, inspiration can help, but basically you need your life to teach you that, to teach you the futility of suffering and craving, and for that inclination in the heart to sort of grow organically. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have thoughts about almost everything.
Touche. What are they?
So I think there's a very simple teaching which goes to that point very directly, but it precedes what Beth mentioned as a way of entering into that inclining the mind towards nibbana. So we could say the highest peace. And that is, well, I'll mention the phrase the Buddha used, which is found in the texts very often. And it's a very short teaching that can describe the path from where we are now to nibbana, to awakening. So it's really simple, although not easy to accomplish. That's why it takes practice. But where the Buddha said in the texts, when we're perceiving impermanence, the mind doesn't cling. When it doesn't cling, it's not agitated. When it's not agitated, it personally experiences nibbana. So this is a very simple progression, but each one of those phrases, has tremendous meaning. So the very first step, and this can be applied in every aspect of our lives. We can refine it, in formal sitting, but it's true and obvious in every part of our lives that everything is changing. But normally we are not highlighting the perception of it. Everybody knows it. We could go up to anybody on the street and say, do things change? And of course, everybody will say yes. But it's very rare that we are actually being mindful in the moment and highlighting the perception of change. And very recently, I came across a phrase, again, from the Buddhist discourses, the suttas, that made this particular aspect that things change even more vivid. And I've been applying it in my own practice a lot. And I just came across this. So in one discourse, the Buddha said, the nature of things is to change. And then he used this phrase, of kind of an unusual phrase. The nature of things is to change, to become otherwise. So becoming otherwise, right? It's not a typical way we would express the truth of change, but it's highlighting in every moment of experience, whether we're seeing it on a micro level or more macro level, things are continually becoming otherwise. So I'll just give you a few examples. When I first read this, and it struck me, the phrase really, oh yeah, things are always becoming otherwise. So I was just doing some walking meditation, and my knee started to hurt. And before that phrase entered my mind, I might have had, oh, I wonder what I did, what happened, something like that. But as soon as my knee started to hurt, the first thought in my mind was, oh, becoming otherwise. It was one way, and it became another way.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a reminder that this is the nature of things. Normally we might often think of different changes as mistakes, and we forget that the inherent nature of all experience is to become otherwise. And then I came back into my house and something happened and something broke. So first thought, oh, becoming otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really has tremendous application in the midst of our daily lives, just to be practicing this and noticing this. Because when we are in the direct perception of change, when we're really seeing it, not just knowing conceptually, and this would be very interesting for all of you folks to really explore for yourselves, because I found it tremendously freeing. And this could be either in a formal sitting meditation or walking meditation, or even just in moving about, but noticing the continual changing nature of things becoming otherwise. I really put to the test that teaching of the Buddha. So he said, when you're perceiving impermanence, the mind doesn't cling. So I checked it out. And I would invite all of you to check it out for yourselves. So it goes from being a conceptual, oh yeah, I agree or I don't agree. It's much more important to have the experience of it and to see for yourselves, is this true or not? So what I noticed when I was really in the flow of change, and it could be simply in the changing sensations of a step, or the changing sensations within a breath, or it could be anything, the changing vibrations of a sound. When we're directly perceiving it, my experience was that the mind is not clinging, because things are continually disappearing. It's not even possible to cling when the perception of change is strong, right? So this is a way of applying this very profound teaching that leads to nibbana, as you asked about in the first question. So we see for ourselves, oh yeah, the mind is not clinging when I'm really seeing the flow of change. And then I further checked out, okay, my mind wasn't clinging. Checked out the next phrase. Is it agitated? No, when it's not clinging, it's not agitated. And so we get a taste, even for a few moments, really of a state of peace. And the reason I'm emphasizing this so much is that this is a practice to do. We need to experience this for ourselves in our own minds. It's not enough to know it conceptually.
Yeah. I want to follow up on that a little bit, Joseph. First of all, thank you for that. I love that framing, becoming otherwise. There is something really potent in that phrasing, for sure. Briefly, we don't have to spend a million years on this, because it might be relevant to only a subset of the people here, which is all right, I suppose. Something else will be relevant to another subset. It's okay. But I have had the experience in meditation, especially on retreat, but also off retreat, where the experience of impermanence is very salient, but in a way that doesn't bring relief. It is painful and difficult. And it's like I'm moment after moment, I'm reaching for something and whiffing, whiff, moment after moment. And I can't stop myself from reaching, it seems. I know intellectually this is the momentariness of phenomena, this is the ungraspability of phenomena, but the mind keeps stubbornly trying to cling, I guess. So how does that fit in to this idea?
Right. So there are two different frameworks for understanding that. The first framework addresses it very directly. And again, it's rooted in one of the most basic teachings of the Buddha. It's found very often in the texts. And interestingly enough, sometimes this one sentence, people would hear it and get enlightened just from hearing that one line. Or, and these are the stories, in the Buddhist discourses, sometimes people would use this line as an expression of their enlightenment. So it's a very powerful line, but it's so simple that we just overlook it. So the basic, again, I'd like to remind everyone, people have heard this line and gotten enlightened. So here's your chance. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. Right? Simple. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. So I have read that a million times. It's just kind of the most basic teaching. But for the longest time, because it's such a simple phrase, I would find, oh yeah, that's true. And so I would acknowledge the truth of it, but it was really on the conceptual level.
Yeah, tell me something I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. However, on one of my self-retreats, I was sitting and kind of deeply into my practice and in the flow of change, and this line came to my mind. Oh, whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. But instead of it just being a thought, a discursive thought, it felt like that teaching kind of dropped right into the midst of the changing process. So it's like it was describing what I was actually experiencing moment to moment. Mm-hmm. And then my mind did something really interesting, quite spontaneously, wasn't planning for it. So I'm sitting in the flow of, continual change. This thought comes, oh yeah, whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. And then my mind said, therefore, there's nothing to want. Hmm. Because whatever it is that I might be wanting, even meditatively, whatever it is that I might be wanting will also pass away. Therefore, there's nothing to want. And as soon as that phrase, arose in my mind, it was almost like arising in my heart, nothing to want, I could feel the dropping back from that leaning forward you were describing. And often in meditation, there is, and it can be really subtle, almost just an energetic leaning into the next moment. Mm-hmm. We're with this moment in order for the next moment to happen, as if the next moment will finally resolve things.
Yeah,
but
trying to get there more quickly.
Moment, and the next moment, and the next moment. And this line, there's nothing to want, just cuts that clinging, that wanting, that desire. And I could feel in that moment, oh, nothing to want. I could feel the mind and the heart relaxing back. And a couple of things here.
Yeah.
One is, and this is super important, and we forget it, that our practice is really the practice of not wanting. That is the essence of the practice, non-craving. For those people, who are with us this evening, it's the heart of the Four Noble Truths. There's the truth of suffering and the cause, which is craving or wanting. The end of suffering, and the third noble truth, is the end of craving. Right? And then the path. So in that moment of reminding ourselves there's nothing to want, and even for a moment, if we can feel that dropping back into, you could say, openness or stillness or non-craving of anything, not wanting, right there, even if it's just for a few moments, we are really touching the depth of the Buddhist teachings. It's an experience of that third noble truth. Again, it may be momentary, but it's real. We're having a direct experience of it, and that itself can provide a tremendous inspiration for our practice, because it's almost as if we've had a temporary experience of the goal, the mind free of craving, and realizing, yes, this is what I'm practicing. It's not about having some meditative experience. So I would suggest, as you were describing your experience, and you find yourself, even as you're seeing impermanence, the continual wanting, you might use this phrase, whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away, therefore there's nothing to want. And see if it effects that dropping back. Again, even for a moment, but it'll give you a taste of it.
Yeah, I'll try that, Joseph. That's interesting. I'll drop that in the next time I'm in that place.
It was very impactful for me. And I still use it. Sometimes I shorten it simply, there's nothing to want.
And so,
and in my
oh, I was going to say, so you are using it, because the first time you describe it sort of emerging spontaneously.
Yeah, no, now I use it.
You deploy it sort of as a.
Yes. And it's a good reminder, because even after all these years of practice, and I know for myself and working with so many yogis, meditators, the tendency to want, meditatively, that leaning forward is just so common. It's so deep, and it can be very subtle. And so the reminder that the essence of the practice is not wanting. So that reframes everything we're doing. Instead of reaching for, it's settling back.
And it's grounding you it's sort of giving the mind a reason not to want too. It's not just saying don't want, it's saying, well, the reason is that everything is passing, right? Everything that arises passes. So like, what are you doing? No, I think that's.
So another, just in that line, this just reminds me of something else I use in the course of my daily life. And people may, I'm not sure what people's responses to this will be, but it's been really helpful for me. So, I can be hanging out with friends and some idea to do this or that, go out to dinner, go which restaurant to go, whatever. It could be anything. And very often, I would say, most typically, my contribution to the conversation will be, whatever you want to do is fine with me. And it's not that, charitably speaking, we might, that's very generous. But that's not really what's motivating it, although there's a kind of a side benefit of it. But it's my realization that 5 minutes after dinner is finished, it won't have mattered at all. That we give such importance to our desires for what we want. And yet when we look back on everything we've experienced in the past, all those fulfilled desires, where are they now? They're gone, and they're gone 1 minute after they're over. So just knowing that, for me, has just made my life so much easier, because it's just, okay, but whatever people would like to do, for the most part. I'm not saying, I always apply this, but a lot. And it just makes for a lot of ease, knowing that things change and it doesn't really matter that much about many things. I mean,
Yeah.
some things do matter a lot.
Sure, of
So I don't
course.
want
No, you said that to me when we were on your back porch in Barry. I said something like, I'm sorry this ended up turning into a meditation interview, Joseph, or something like that. And you just said very matter-of-factly, you were like, I don't care what we talk about. And there was it wasn't dismissive. It was purely just the truth, I think. And I just thought that was so funny and so telling. Just like, I don't care. Honestly, whatever you want. And it reminds me of when I was in Barry on retreat, one of the teachers, Deborah Helzer, who's wonderful, she talked about phenomena leave no residue. And
yes,
and that's exactly what you're talking about, that like in this moment it's here, the next moment it's gone, and it leaves nothing behind at all. That moment there's nothing left. There's just the next moment now. And so, the conversation leaves no residue, right? If I decided to have that biscotti cookie that they give me on the plane, that's going to leave no residue. I mean, it might leave some residue around my waistline, but that's really it. But yeah, no,
unless one is not really attending to the momentary nature of things. And as we all know, it's very possible for the mind to start obsessing in thought about what may have just happened. But that's because we're not seeing clearly the nature of things to continually become otherwise.
Right. Yeah.
So people, and we all, to some extent or other, can get caught up, in ruminating about a past conversation or whatever. But to the degree that we're refining our perception of change, that happens a lot less, and it's not quite so sticky.
Yeah. Wow. That was just so funny that you brought that up, that tendency in conversation, because I was like, I know exactly what he did that. I saw him do that. Yeah, this is wonderful, Joseph. I want to ask maybe one or two more questions, but can we do it in sort of like a lightning round style? Because I want to open the floor. Could you do like a quick lightning round? Okay. One is, there are all these meditation apps, right? I don't need to belabor that point. Everyone knows about those. It's wild that happened. I know that you're on some of those apps. I think you're in 10% Happier. I think you might be on the Waking Up app somewhere. But separate from, giving a meditation course or whatever the case may be, if you had the ability, the magical ability to snap your fingers and then add and have one thing appear in every meditation app so that anyone using those apps would encounter it, what would that thing be? It might be a lesson, it might be a teaching, just a thought, it might be a style meditation, anything. But you can just snap your fingers and suddenly every meditation app includes that.
Don't cling.
All right.
But, over these many years, I've practiced with a lot of teachers in different traditions, and people can get really caught up in attachment to a particular tradition or technique or method. But in my experience, and I wrote about this in the book One Dharma, I think there is really one Dharma, and in my experience, the essence of every teaching of the Buddha. And he expressed it. This is one of the phrases he uses: liberation through non-clinging. So when people ask me what I practice, it's not this method or that method. It's practicing not clinging. That's the practice. All
right. So you'd put those words in big bold letters at the loading screen of every meditation app.
Yes.
All right. And then let's see, relating to this idea of traditions, while they are distinct, having lots in common, having lots to say to each other, and in your view, being different manifestations of one Dharma, your training, most of it, you've had a lot of training now, but your initial training, at least, and a lot of your training and a lot of your teaching is in what we might call the Mahasi tradition of Vipassana practice, is at least my understanding. I don't want to put you in a box, but
I also did. I studied for quite a few years with Goenkaji, which is another method of Vipassana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a different.
So,
a different style. Yeah. I guess what I was going to ask was, like, when I read your book Mindfulness, I really feel Mahasi's influence and Upendita's and that whole lineage coming through, along with others, of course. You cite people from all schools of Buddhism. My question is, for people, there are people in this room, this virtual room, who practice all sorts of different styles, schools, teachings, methods. If you could take one thing from, if we want to include Goenkaji, from the Burmese Vipassana tradition, and sort of give it to people in other traditions that they could helpfully incorporate into, without switching styles, but in their own style, if there was something that they could helpfully incorporate from, some wisdom, some lesson from that's distinctive to the Burmese Vipassana tradition, can you think of what that might be? If you could sort of gift wrap it and hand it to them, here, incorporate this into your practice, whatever your practice may be. Here's some wisdom from this tradition.
Well, I think what I'm about to say is actually in all the traditions, but it's very explicit in the Vipassana, the various Vipassana methods. And that is just to emphasize that mindfulness is not an end in itself, but it's a methodology, right? And all of the Buddhist traditions, in one way or another, talk about mindfulness. So that really is universal in terms of the Buddhist teaching. This is the method. And so then the question that I would suggest could be very revealing for people is to simply ask the question, what am I learning from being mindful? Because then that points to mindfulness as a methodology for the development of wisdom, that it's not simply the end in itself. But often we may forget that. We think, oh, I'm just practicing mindfulness for its own sake. And of course, it has a lot of benefits, but in terms of liberation, mindfulness is in the service of wisdom. And so then we just want to highlight through our own investigation and exploration. And here a teacher can be really helpful. Well, here I'm practicing mindfulness. What am I learning from being mindful? And there's a whole range of things that we can learn. So that's the question I would suggest people in any tradition ask themselves.
A question definitely worth asking. And you do hear people talk about, I'm trying to be mindful. I'm really working on being mindful. And you do almost want to ask, yeah, but why? Don't lose sight of that. Yeah, that's really helpful, Joseph. Thank you. Why don't we open it up to Q&A? Is that all right with you, Joseph?
Sure.
All right, let's do it. So
just easy questions.
Easy questions only. We're dealing with a beginner here, so go easy on the guy, all right? Okay. Joseph, you have practiced deeply in various traditions, Theravada and Tibetan. And my question is, how ought one go about choosing a path? I find myself pulled between these two paths and don't know how to choose. Fortunate to have access to teachers in both.
Well, I think it really depends where one is on the path. So, for example, if one is just beginning, and the beginning, I don't mean the first 10 minutes. Beginning could be the first few years of practice, or even longer than that. But as one is establishing a practice, I think it's really helpful to devote one's energy to one method so that we actually learn it in depth and begin to experience the fruit of that practice. In terms of choosing, if one is at that stage of practice, in a way, it doesn't matter because both paths, so many different paths, are skillful or good. And so I would say to choose the one which most inspires you to do the practice, right? Because that'll give you energy to actually do it. After some time, when we've really come to an understanding, a reasonably deep understanding of a particular path of practice, then I think it's fine to explore other paths and even to see how they can interweave and intermingle. Now, it's just to say that there are some teachers who don't approve of this approach. There are some teachers who think you should just pick one and stay with it until the end. And for some people, that is really helpful. But for others, I have the kind of mind that likes to explore and likes to synthesize, aspects of the different traditions. And so, for example, for me, at this point, Dzogchen and Vipassana, in their essence, they're the same, which is liberation through non-clinging. So all of the methods, even if the methods seem contradictory, or the metaphysical underpinnings are saying opposite things, which in my own practice, for me for a while, was very confusing, until I realized that all of the methods and traditions are skillful means for not clinging. And so, because that's the bottom line, that's the essence, that's the nature of liberation, the mind free of any grasping at anything. So the Buddha expressed this very explicitly. He said, nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. Whoever has heard this has heard all the teachings. So there's nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. And one reads this, whether it's in the Pali Canon or in Tibetan, this is the essence. So at a certain point, and for my own kind of mental configuration, after having established, the depth in a particular practice, for me, it's energizing just to explore some different ways without getting attached to the method, realizing that they're all skillful means for not clinging. Is this method working for me in that regard? And if it is, then it's a good practice for you. If it's not, then it's not the right practice for you. But to really see what the essence is, rather than thinking which is right and which is wrong, which I had been doing for a long time until I realized that's completely the wrong question.
Thank you for that, Joseph. I hope that was helpful for the questioners. All right, let's see. Someone asked, how much concentration is necessary to see impermanence in the way Joseph just described? Just described being some time ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, not much, surprisingly. So I'll give an example of how one can attune to a very refined perception of change without really having developed much concentration at all. And I did this on a recent self-retreat. I was just going for a walk. So it was, I was trying to do a mindful walk, but it wasn't like, a formal meditation walk. It was just going for a walk in nature, trying to be mindful. And then I had the thought, well, what happened to the step from 5 minutes ago? And I saw it was completely gone. And then my mind got interested. Well, what about the step from 3 minutes ago? 1 minute ago? Gone, completely gone. I couldn't find it. What about the step from 10 seconds ago? From 1 second ago? Until I brought my mind right to that forward edge of the movement of the step and the sensations of the movement continually falling away. It's like water over waterfall. And so each of the sensations of the step, which were very easy to feel, it's just feeling the sensations of the foot and leg and movement. So you don't need a lot of concentration, particularly for that. It's just remembering to do it. But it was so amazing to me. It brought the mind right to that moment of each moment's sensation falling away, falling away, falling away. It was just like water over a waterfall. So that's a very refined perception of change in a very ordinary circumstance, just going for a walk, And this would be another place to experience then, okay, in seeing impermanence right in that moment of things falling away, is the mind clinging? And what's really very interesting is to see that it's impossible to cling at that moment because things are continually falling away, falling away. It's like, can you cling to the water going over the lip of the waterfall? Impossible. So we're getting a very deep experience of impermanence, of not clinging in the midst of a very ordinary experience. In formal meditation, I think more often than not, we need more foundation of concentration because of the tendency for the mind just to get lost in thought. So this is a common hindrance in meditation practice. So in the formal sitting, to sustain that level of perception of change, it takes there is a kind of concentration called access concentration, where there's enough steadiness of mind so that things are flowing along pretty much by themselves, and we don't have to struggle to be in the flow. But I'll just give an example of how we experience that shift from the initial struggle to be steady to where it's more natural. So if you think of an arch, and we're balancing on the top of the arch and fall off on one side, and kind of have to struggle to get back to the top, and fall off on the other side, and struggle to get back up. So this is what our practice is often like until there's a certain level of concentration. We're always, with the breath, the mind wanders, we're pulling it back off. But at a certain point, the arch inverts and becomes a trough. And we're just balanced at the bottom of the trough. And still the mind will be pulled off center, but very naturally it falls back. So instead of having to struggle to get back to the top, at this place of concentration, the mind just naturally comes back by itself. So that's what I'm calling the point of access concentration. There's enough momentum to have that kind of ease in the practice. But it's not to wait for that, because as I said, as in the example with the walking, we can really get very refined in some very ordinary circumstances.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks for answering that question. I have a question here from Lynn. Hi, Lynn. Lynn asks, as you practice meditation and deepen in the practice, what do you observe about your emotions? Do you find them to be less present? How does your practice change the way you see the emotional aspects of our human nature?
Well, a few different things happen. One is we become more aware of the range of emotions that are arising in the mind. And people, there's a wide range of how attuned people are to their emotions. Some people are very attuned, and they really know what they're feeling. Other people, not so much. They may know they're feeling something, but they're not really clear about what they're feeling. Generally, in the practice, we get very clear, over time. So when there's a stronger, even a subtle emotion arising, we become mindful of it, become aware. So the first part is just getting more and more attuned to the emotions that are arising. Then, and this is the critical point, the practice changes how we're relating to the emotions. And this is a point actually, which is the key to the whole meditation practice. We tend to think that it's the experience, whatever the experience which is arising, that is important. But that's not really the essence of the practice. The practice is about how we're relating to whatever is arising. So it's the relationship to experience that is the essence of the practice, not the particular experience. So with respect to emotion, this is very important because emotions, in the whole range of our human experience, emotions in some way are what we most personalize, because we can get a sense, of thoughts coming and going, and even though we get lost in them and caught up in them a lot, it's not that hard to begin to get a sense of, the passing phenomena like a sound, and even the different sensations in the body. It can begin to see, maybe to some extent, the impersonality of them. But when there's a strong emotion, it's very seductive. We tend to personalize them. We tend to feel them as being self, as being I, and caught up in them. And sometimes they're positive emotions or afflictive emotions. They can be either. So our practice is really learning to open to the emotion without identifying with it. And there are a few ways of doing this. One teacher, Ajahn Sumedho, had a good phrase to use when there's a different emotion arising. The phrase he would use is, anger feels like this, right? Desire feels like this. Joy feels like this. So it's really taking the I out of it, taking the self, and it almost becomes, it's almost like a scientific investigation of the nature of the emotion. Okay, well, what actually is anger or sadness or happiness? So we're really exploring the experience of it without adding or superimposing the sense of I or mine. So this then, our lives become so much freer when emotions can arise and we feel them fully, but without identifying with them, without holding on to them, letting them arise and pass through. There's a really nice Tibetan image talking about thoughts and emotions. Thoughts and emotions pass through the mind like clouds in the sky, no roots, no home. And I love the image because sometimes I'll just play with the image of a thought or an emotion like a cloud in the sky with a root coming down, mine, right? And of course, the image is so ridiculous because clouds don't have roots, right? But to use that image to see how, in fact, we do root thoughts and emotions through identification with them. And then just to remind ourselves, that's extra. That's not the experience of the emotion itself. That's how we're relating to the emotion. And to settle back into a more spacious mind space. Thoughts and emotions, arise and pass through the mind like clouds in the sky. So that's a very freeing way of being with the various emotions.
Thanks for that, Joseph. Question here from Stephen. Stephen asks, can you describe a pivotal moment in your life where it started to become clear what the Dharma path looked like for you in the long term? What was that moment like, and what did you discover about your unique path? And I'll call that practice oriented, because I think that it can perhaps have bearing on other people's practice, and it's about your practice.
Well, so I'll give it was a very powerful moment, very simple, right at the very beginning of my practice. So I had been, I studied philosophy in college. Then right after college, I went into the Peace Corps. And I was teaching English in Bangkok. And that's where I got interested in Buddhism. So I was going to these discussion groups for Westerners, but there were some Buddhist monks who were leading them. But having just come from all those years of studying philosophy, I would ask a million questions in these groups. People stopped coming because I was there, because it was so annoying to people. So I'm sure we've all been in groups with people like that. So finally,
or been the one in the group.
Yes. So finally, one of the monks, I think out of desperation, he said, Joseph, why don't you try meditating? And I was young. I was like 21 years old, and in Asia for the first time, it was all completely exotic. I didn't know anybody who was meditating and knew any of this. It was all brand new. And so it sounded intriguing. So it gave me the most simple instructions, being with the breath. So I go back to my room, I get my paraphernalia together to sit. I set my alarm clock for 5 minutes. Something really remarkable happened in that first 5 minutes. And it was not that it was some big enlightenment experience. But what I saw so clearly, and this was one of those transformative moments, what I saw so clearly, just right then, in the first 5 minutes of sitting, that I saw clearly that there was a way, there was a methodology for looking into the mind as well as looking out through it. And that was revelatory to me. The fact that one could actually turn one's attention inward with a methodology for sorting it all out, because, we could try to be looking in, but if we don't have a method, it can be completely confusing and overwhelming, with thoughts and emotions and all kinds of things happening. So to have a method for turning in and understanding the mind, I was blown away by that. I was so blown away that for a while I was inviting my friends over to watch me meditate. They didn't come back too often. But that's how excited, I was young and I was just so excited by it all. Because it
probably didn't sell too many tickets to that show.
No. In fact, they wanted a refund.
Well,
so
that's great.
That was a very critical moment.
Thanks for sharing that, Joseph. That's wonderful. And I can see why it struck you so strongly when you met Munindraji, who famously said to you, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. Obviously, you were very primed for that.
Yes, exactly.
Break you wide open.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, I have a question here from Lynn. Hi, Lynn. John, could you ask Joseph if he has any advice for people who haven't been able to find a teacher? I'm very active in my search for a spiritual teacher and did work with a few teachers in the past. However, they showed traits that were questionable, crossing personal boundaries, etc. Maybe I wasn't ready. Is it true that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear? So there's the question.
Well, what I would suggest now, especially with the technology being what it is, and Dharma talks and videos and from so many different teachers are readily available. I would just explore, listening to some Dharma talks, and seeing if you can find one or more teachers where you really resonate with this style of teaching, and how they're teaching. And then if you find that you really resonate, then to explore further and see, okay, are there either retreats in person or online, that you could join with that teacher. And so beginning to establish a connection. And then it is important to observe the behavior of teachers, because as we know, and there are plenty of stories of teachers who in some respects may be really wonderful, but in others cross some boundaries, ethical boundaries, and so as students, we really want to be watchful. The Dalai Lama said, before you really commit to a teacher, you should spend 5 years with them watching, observing. So that we may not take it to that extent, but it points to the fact that, it's not just a blind surrender, even after we feel some connection, but it's really to see, okay, is there an integrity, in their teaching and their lives? So I would just explore until finding, the ones where the teaching resonates, and then try to follow up and try to make some kind of connection, again, either online or in-person retreats.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks, Joseph. And I'll just append to that every time we have a teacher here, at least more recently I've been doing this, I make sure to ask them, do you work with students one-on-one, whether virtually or in person? I ask that except when the answer is obvious, as it is in some cases. But I am actually compiling a list of teachers that I know will do even virtual programming one-on-one. I'm listing whether they are Dharma-based or fee-based or whatever the case may be. So I'm trying to put that together to make it a little bit easier for people to actually have that one-on-one relationship. So stay tuned for that. It's not that hard to do. I'm just putting together a spreadsheet. So that's not Joseph obviously gave a much deeper substantive answer, but just in terms of like the pure logistics of it, this might help. So I just wanted to mention
definitely.
that.
Yeah.
Let's see. We have some other great questions here. What's next? Okay. How does one travel down the path while one's significant other or others are not joining in the path? Is that possible?
It's definitely possible. And it's more possible, of course, if they're supportive, even if they're not particularly interested, but they love you enough to support your own interest in pursuing this. It's definitely possible, and I would not hesitate to pursue the path, even if one's partner doesn't. They may have their own particular interests and passions, and there's no need, for both people in a relationship to necessarily be walking the same path. And as I say, of course, it would be helpful if each can be supportive of the other's interests. But even if not, I still, even if not, which would be a more difficult situation, but to find a way to continue the practice, because from my perspective, there's nothing more important. It's like the whole point of the practice is to purify the heart of greed and hatred and delusion. And when we look at what's happening in the world today, which is, there's so much suffering on so many different levels. And I would say most of it, there are things like natural disasters and stuff like that, but so much of the suffering comes from the manifestation of forces in the mind like greed, and like anger and hatred and fear. This is the cause of suffering. And so to the extent that we can work to purify our own hearts of those qualities and slowly diminish them and in the end uproot them, that is the most important thing we can be doing for ourselves and everyone else. So even if the circumstances are trying, and challenging, I think it would still be worth trying to carve out, a time and a place for practice. But hopefully in most relationships, there would be the mutual support, even if one person is not exactly following the path. I don't see that as a problem.
Thanks for that, Joseph. Let's see, from Molly. What is your sage advice for someone, me, preparing to attend my first 9-day insight meditation retreat? Trying not to have expectations for myself, and I read in your book, Insight Meditation, that you initially on retreat just sat and walked. That is what I will try to do. Other advice?
That is the best advice. I think if you can actually, expectations are a huge hindrance because they rarely come to fruition. The practice is going to unfold in its own way with a lot of ups and downs. It's one of the things that people quickly learn on this path is that it's not a bliss trip. It's not that you come to retreat and every day you get more and more blissful. No, there's lots of ups and downs and working with challenging things, and then sometimes it's beautiful and peaceful, and then more challenges. So really understanding that flow of changing experience, both pleasant and unpleasant, is the path. It's not a mistake. Just one example, which I've seen in my own practice so many times. I could be having a great sitting, meaning everything was peaceful and the mind was concentrated, and then the thought to get up, oh, maybe I'll get up now and then I'll just pick this up in my next sitting. And the next sitting could be full of boredom or restlessness or something, pain in the body. Can't count. Things are always becoming otherwise. And so not having expectations of how things should unfold, but just being with the flow, whether pleasant or unpleasant. And this is the key, not being attached to the pleasant, not feeling aversion to the unpleasant. That's what we learn. So I think this person already has internalized the best advice.
Sit and walk. Thanks, Joseph.
Without expectation, just
right.
Without expectation, and just being with whatever presents itself.
Well, thanks. Let's see. One more question. How does a practitioner who believes in God realize nibbana? Are their faith and relationship to God able to stay? I ask because I've heard conflicting responses from teachers.
Well, it's a very complex question because people mean different things by the word God. I mean, it's easy to say the word, but then it would be very interesting to explore, what do you mean by that word, or what does that word mean for you? So there could be a wide range of personal understandings of God. It could be, some great being up in the sky on one side. On the other end, God could be another word for the Dharma, meaning the truth, just the truth of things, ultimate truth or ultimate peace. And it's interesting. So just as an example of this, and what I'm about to say, I'm really not an expert in, but I've done a little reading. So just as an example, when you read some of the Christian mystics, and they're describing their experience of God, very different than the more conventional understanding of how people conceive of God. Right? So this is even within the same tradition. Just within the Christian tradition, there is a wide range of understanding. So in order to respond to the question, one would have to know, well, what do you mean? So when I read some of the Christian mystics, the description of their experience felt very compatible with the deepest understanding of enlightenment or awakening, or the Buddha's understanding of the highest truth. Right? And likewise in Buddhism, there is a convention, people go and pray to the Buddha and, ask for all kinds of things. So that's the conventional popular level. Very different than people who've really done a lot of practice and have experienced the deeper realization of the Dharma. So every tradition has this spectrum of understanding about what Buddha means, what God means. And that would be a very interesting exploration for a person in any tradition, to really investigate, well, what is the highest aspiration within this tradition? What does it mean? Right. And, how do I relate to it?
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. And I totally second that. I mean, when I read Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, the sort of founder of comparative religion as a field of study, I was struck. It was almost all anecdotes from religious experiences had by Christians, but I was just struck by the similarities. It was really astonishing between those reports and the reports of Buddhist contemplatives. So, yeah. All right, well, we are at 2 minutes to the hour. So let's wrap up here so we don't keep Joseph late. I want to apologize to anyone whose questions we didn't get to. We just had a zillion questions and they came in fast. But thank you for everyone who is here. Joseph, thank you so much for your time, for your generosity, for the teachings. On behalf of everyone here, very, very grateful to you. Is there anything that you want to say before we say goodnight?
Don't cling. It was really lovely being with everyone, and it's always energizing to have a chance to share the Dharma. So
thank you, Joseph.
You all. Yeah.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone.
Yeah.
Good night. See you soon.